He could have seen what was coming behind Trump's failure on the virus. Mr. Trump repeatedly played down the seriousness of the virus and focused on other issues. An array of figures inside his government, from top White House advisors to experts deep in the cabinet departments and intelligence agencies, identified the threat, sounded alarms, and made clear the need for aggressive action. Even after Mr. Trump took his first concrete action at the end of January, limiting travel from China, public health often had to compete with economic and political considerations in internal debates, slowing the path toward belated decisions to seek more money from Congress, obtain necessary supplies, address shortfalls in testing, and ultimately move to keep much of the nation at home. Unfolding as it did in the wake of his impeachment by the House and in the midst of his Senate trial, Mr. Trump's response was colored by his suspicion of and disdain for what he viewed as the deep state, the very people in his government whose expertise and long experience might have guided him more quickly towards steps that would slow the virus, and likely save lives. Despite Mr. Trump's denial weeks later, he was told at the time about a January 29 memo produced by his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, laying out in striking detail the potential risks of a coronavirus pandemic, as many as 500,000 deaths and trillions of dollars in economic losses. By the third week in February, the administration's top public health experts concluded they should recommend to Mr. Trump a new approach that would include warning the American people of the risks and urging steps like social distancing and staying home from work. But in the turbulence of the Trump White House, it took 3 more weeks to persuade the president that failure to act quickly to control the spread of the virus would have dire consequences. They would soon need to move toward aggressive social distancing, even at the risk of severe disruption to the nation's economy and the daily lives of millions of Americans. Mr. Trump was walking up the steps of Air Force One to head home from India on February 25 when Dr. Nancy Messonnier, the director of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases, publicly issued the blunt warning they had all agreed was necessary. The meeting that evening with Mr. Trump to advocate social distancing was cancelled, replaced by a news conference in which the president announced that the White House response would be put under the command of Vice President Mike Pence. It would be more than 3 weeks before Mr. Trump would announce serious social distancing efforts, a lost period during which the spread of the virus accelerated rapidly. The early alarms sounded by Mr. Pottinger and other China hawks were freighted with ideology, including a push to publicly blame China that critics in the administration say was a distraction as the coronavirus spread to Western Europe and eventually the United States. Mr. Pottinger initially suspected that President Xi Jinping's government was keeping a dark secret, that the virus may have originated in one of the laboratories in Wuhan studying deadly pathogens. From the time the virus was first identified as a concern, the administration's response was plagued by the rivalries and factionalism that routinely swirl around Mr. Trump and, along with the president's impulsiveness, undercut decision-making and policy development. A few days later, on the evening of January 30, Mick Mulvaney, the acting White House Chief of Staff at the time, and Mr. Azar called Air Force One as the president was making the final decision to go ahead with the restrictions on China travel. Mr. Azar was blunt, warning that the virus could develop into a pandemic and arguing that China should be criticized for failing to be transparent. Mr. Trump had agreed to give an Oval Office address on the evening of March 11 announcing restrictions on travel from Europe, where the virus was ravaging Italy.